What is the story of World War I? Revised edition. In 1914, an Archduke Franz Ferdinand, aka heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, is assassinated by a Serbian nationalist named Pavelio Princip. Austria-Hungary blames Serbia for aiding the assassin, and thus they sent an ultimatum demanding humiliating concessions. Serbia rejects and Austria-Hungary declares war. Now, Austria-Hungary originally intended for this to be a war between just the two of them, but this does not go according to plan, and many other powers begin to move inside. Now, Austria-Hungary is part of the Triple Alliance. It is made up of Germany, who fears its circumvented by its neighbors, Austria-Hungary, who's clinging on to a fragile empire, and Italy, who wants land. Then we have the triple entity. France, Britain, and Russia all want to stop Germany, Europe's new strongest power. Now, when Austria-Hungary invades Serbia, Germany decides to help out Austria-Hungary, a fellow ally, and thus they declare war on Serbia. However, Russia, who has Serbia as an ally, wants to have a fellow Slav nation. Thus, they declare war on Austria-Hungary and Germany, and soon both Germany and Russia are clashing in Poland. Now, Russia also had an alliance with France, so that's why France also declared war on Germany. Another reason is because of the Franco-Prussian War of 1871, in which France lost Alsace-Lorraine. Now they want that back. And thus, as you can see, the war is already beginning to turn into many different powers. However, even more big begin to come out. Italy, surprisingly though, remains neutral despite being part of the Triple Alliance. This is mainly because of the rules. The Triple Alliance doesn't force other nations to join into wars. It's themselves, it has their own personal things. If they want to join, if they don't want, they can't join. So that is why Italy doesn't join the war. However, some other nations do. For example, the UK. UK joins in because of a little issue. The thing is, Germany plans a great encirclement attack on France. They'll blitzkrieg through Belgium and attack Paris from the north, and thus win a big victory, and then move those troops east to attack Russia. However, this goes very much wrongly according to plan, mainly when Belgian troops stubbornly hold the border. Now, Britain has guaranteed the neutrality of Belgium. The neutrality which Belgium has guaranteed, and thus when Germany occupies Belgium, British sent in an ultimatum demanding that they withdraw. Germany refused it, and Britain declared war. Now, the British Navy is the largest navy in the entire world, and they closed a naval blockade at Germany, hoping to starve her out of food. And thus a massive naval battle begins to area out in the North Sea as the power of dominance begins to come out. For other powers soon began to join in. In Africa, meanwhile, a massive force begins to attack, mainly because Austria-Hungary doesn't have any colonies. However, Germany does. The colonies are German and Cameroon, German Tanganyika, German Namibia, and German and other territories. Also have small territories in Papua New Guinea as well. So 3 in Africa and in Southeast Asia, while the British occupied the southern half of the Papua New Guinea, while the Germans occupied the northern half. So the British attacked from there and quickly occupied the entirety of Papua New Guinea. From there, German Tanganyika completely seized, however, to hold down many troops for the entire war. German Cameroon, though, provides stiff resistance, but is slowly dying out. And Namibia it doesn't have that many defenses and is quickly faltering out. 1915. The war in Europe is going on, but then something ablaze happens. The Ottoman Empire, which was once great, now known as the sick old man of Europe, joined the Central Powers. From then there they launched other attacks and things, mainly against British forces in Iraq and Palestine. From then there they began to force their way out. However, due to the fact that they are not very strong and they have lost a lot of their land, they soon began to falter out again. British, however, the British do make heavy losses. British forces in Iraq, Kut. However, the British do have multiple different problems. British forces in Kut, Iraq, just a few miles south from Baghdad, who have been sieged for 6 months, surrendered to the Ottomans. This does put this does dip morale slightly. However, it is not much of an issue. However, then another blow comes in. RMS Lusitania, one of the grandest liners in the entire British fleet, is sunk. However, she's a passenger ship, and about 1,500 people, 1,128 people perish. Out of those are 128 Americans. US President Woodrow Wilson is very agitated, and the public soon is too. However, don't want anything that it was just an accident and the British were spying in weapons and stuff across these liners to support the fleet. However, it seemed the war conflict quickly began to escalate even further and further, and many different powers came in. However, last year in 1914, meanwhile, Japan joined the Allies. This is mainly because of the new treaty that Japan had done before during the Sino-Japanese War that occurred between Russia and Japan in 1904 or something, and Britain allied with it at that time. Thus, Japan joins the Allies. China is still slightly outraged, but Wilson is still pro-Allies, however, it has not directly joined it yet. Soon, many different powers begin to meddle in. 1915. Many different things began to come out, and many different other wars began to come out. 1916. Many different new powers and many different new powers are. 1916. Many different powers began to fight in Europe and Africa and other areas. Japanese see small little German bases on islands, while in Europe many different fighting go on. Germany does make small advancement, but isn't really that successful. However, Russia is losing hard. Many troops have to share just one gun between 8 men, so it's very hard, to shoot stuff. And another thing is that the once good Russian Cossacks, the Benudin cavalry, are absolutely being demolished by German machine guns, which is quite surprising since they naturally want to dominate, even led to the fall of Napoleon Bonaparte. However, they are now proved highly inefficient, and Russia is slowly collapsing. However, Austria-Hungary is collapsing even further. Austria-Hungary itself is broken up into multiple different groups. There are political groups such as Czechs, Slovaks, Austrians, Hungarians, Serbians, Russians or Ukrainians, Romanians, Bulgarians, Montenegrins, Bosnians, Croats, Slovenians, Italians, and more. There are also some religious groups like Muslims living in Bosnia, or Serbia, or Christians living in the rest of the empire. The empire itself is pretty much fragmenting, however just barely holding on. Many different fighting begins to take out and other things. However, due to the constant fighting from Russia, it begins to deteriorate, and the condition for the Allies slowly begins to worsen. 1916. At this point, trench warfare has almost completely stopped movement across Europe for a little bit more than 2 years. Thus, the British invent a new weapon that they think can break the deadlock of the trenches. It is called the tank. About 90 of these are built, and even though only about 5 actually worked, it is enough to convince the British government to make 400 more. Soon, France and Germany are both using tanks of their own, however Germany only deploys around 13. First the British deploy most, and so do the French. Lots of different things occur on the front. Some issues maybe for the fact the Austrians begin to suffer greatly. However, in 1915, the Italians have joined. However, due to Russian losses, they were put back, but now have begun to regain most of the land and began to do large casualty estimates. One of their biggest battles cost the Austrians 300,000 casualties. At this point, the Central Power and the Allied powers are both beginning to get exhausted. Meanwhile, in the Ottoman Empire, therefore this take revenge for the Quds disaster and to occupy Baghdad, and the entirety of Palestine is completely overrun by British and French forces, and soon they begin to move up from both sides. However, Bulgaria joined the Central Powers. They, along with Austria-Hungary, destroy Serbia, and then in the rest of the Serbian army, we retreat to Albania. And then Albania leaves the war, and Montenegro, now with almost no hope of reinforcement, surrenders. However, Greece joins the Allied powers and begins launching many attacks on the Ottoman Empire, which at this point is fragmented. Romania, fellow Allied power, since 1915, is now caught between two fronts. Down from Austria-Hungary and Serbia, they both launch attacks, and thus the Romanians are forced to put their entire army along the Russian border. Romania is effectively mostly overrun. 1917. 1917 is a good year for the Allies. Many different powers like Brazil, Liberia, China, and other powers join in. So we'll do a brief summary on which powers they are. The Central Powers consist of Germany, Japan. The Central Powers consist of Germany, Austria-Hungary, the Ottoman Empire, and Bulgaria. While the Allied powers consist of Britain, France, Russia, China, Japan, Liberia, Brazil, Romania, Serbia, Montenegro, Albania, Greece, Portugal, recently joined in because of the Anglo-Portuguese War, and while other powers all over the world. And then the US joins in on the war too. This is mainly because of a few different reasons. The first was of course the Lusitania. Other reasons are because of oil coasted bombing. Another thing is because of the way that Germany has developed a shoot-on-sight tactic for their torpedoes launched submarines. Thus what essentially happens is that the rule is that any ship that ships that aren't German will be sunk. This, however, means that neutral ships will be caught in the crossfire. Thus the US joins in on the war. However, Russia is forced to leave the war because of the Russian Civil War, in which communist forces completely seized control of Russia. And thus they signed a peace treaty with Germany, ceding over the entirety of the Baltics, half of Belarus, and almost all of Ukraine to them. This brings Russia out of the war. However, with the fresh arrival of new American troops, the tide of war begins to change, because now the supply routes can be changed again. Around 10,000 troops arrive in Europe every day. At this point, the Central Powers are completely in collapse, and it is not going very well. 1918. The Central Powers at this point are faltering out. Bulgaria signs an armistice, and when the Ottoman Empire collapses, the other two are broken away. Austria-Hungary collapses in on itself. However, Germany keeps fighting on. The German Grand Fleet, ordered to make a suicidal attack on Britain, mutinies, which leads to more chaos in Hamburg. At this point, they will launch a last-ditch effort to stop the Allies. So what happens is that Germany attacks into with neighboring France, most attack into Belgium. However, they soon retreat due to fresh forces. A few months later, they attempt the same tactic. However, the same results, they move south to France. They make heavy gains, but at that point, two fresh divisions, the 1st and 2nd Divisions, charge straight at the German center, breaking momentum and soon faltering away. Germans are completely in retreat, and now with this fresh front, they continue pushing onward, and a battle for Germany itself continues. Eventually, they reach the Hindenburg Line, a line of reinforced German defenses, and break through. Germany is collapsing. At this point, contrary attacks from other powers results in Germany forced to sign an armistice, and effectively, World War II finally comes to an end. Stretching from 1914 to 1918, World War I has at this point become the biggest war in history. Many people perished during this war. Germany suffered not lessly compared to their other fellow allies. They only lost territory in the north. They only lost a small piece of northern Germany, which went to Denmark, Alsace-Lorraine, which has returned to France, and 13% of land in the east was to be left for the creation of the new country of Poland. And thus, Germany didn't suffer that much. However, their navy and other economical things were suspended heavily, and so was their army. This was sort of seeds for future conflict. The old Austro-Hungarian Empire was broken up, and a few new countries were created: Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia. Serbia and Montenegro were united with Yugoslavia, while Italy got the rest of Venetia and small other territories. And a lot of new independent countries were created. Austria was still allowed to live, however, it lost most of its best farmland to Hungary, who became independent, and had to give a small piece of East Galicia to Russia, and the entirety of Transylvania to Romania. Bulgaria didn't lose all that much land, however, they did lose their entire coastal area bordering the Aegean Sea, which all went to Greece. The old Ottoman Empire was broken up into what was now modern Turkey, and the rest was known as an independent zone. However, this was more of a fake area. The strip of Ottoman territory that went down around the entire Red Sea coast came from the Kingdom of Hejaz, which went to Saudi Arabia. However, Palestine, Jordan, and Iraq, Kuwait, all went to Britain, while France got Lebanon and Syria, while the entirety of Turkey was split up into different economic zones. And yeah. So, Central Powers lost and the Allied Powers won, but it came at a heavy price. Many people were killed. Serbia suffered greatly. 1/3 of the army had died. The highest rate for any country. Russia had lost the largest numbers. But however, everybody really suffered. However, in this, new life emerged. Old empires vanished. New states emerged. The world was never the same again. Thank you for watching.